The alarm cut through my sleep before my eyes even opened, and I was on my feet with my boots half-laced before my mind caught up with my body. Every officer aboard the Ashvane Vigil trained for this moment 100 times, yet nothing about the drills prepared me for the sound of that particular alarm, the one reserved only for a single kind of event. An unknown vessel had entered our border space, and it had not asked permission. I ran through the narrow corridor, past crew members pressed against the walls to let me pass, past the flickering warning lights painted in a color our people used only for true emergencies. My mind raced through every possibility. Pirates did not carry the codes to trigger that alarm. Rebel factions from the outer rim did not have ships capable of slipping past our detection grid. Whatever had arrived was something new, and new things terrified me more than anything familiar ever could. I reached the bridge and found it already full, officers standing at their stations, with tension carved into their faces. Commander Yeslin Draor stood at the center of it all, her arms folded, her eyes fixed on the massive view screen ahead of us. I moved quietly to my post beside the tactical display, trying to slow my breathing, trying to look like an officer who belonged there and not one who had rushed out of bed only minutes before. On the screen floated a single ship. It did not look like much. It was smaller than our own vessel by a wide margin, its hull a dull gray with no visible weapon ports, no shields flickering around its frame, no fighters launching from hidden bays. It simply hung there in the black, motionless, as if it had every right in the galaxy to be exactly where it was. "Report," Commander Drayor said, and her voice carried the calm of someone who had commanded through a dozen crises before this one. I respected her for that calm, even as my own hands trembled slightly against the console. "Unknown vessel, ma'am," said Officer Renkala from the sensor station. "No match in any assembly database. Hull configuration does not correspond to any known species architecture. No weapons signature detected. No shields active. Life signs indicate a single occupant. A single occupant." The words hung in the air of the bridge like a held breath. An entire ship, however small, crossing into contested assembly space, carrying only one living being aboard it. I had served on this vessel for 6 years, and I had never heard of anything so strange. "Species identification?" Drayor asked. Kala hesitated before answering, and that hesitation told me more than his words did. Preliminary scans suggest the occupant matches recorded profiles for a species called human, recently catalogued. No prior contact with the assembly, no treaties, no trade agreements, no diplomatic record of any kind. I had heard the name before, in passing, in briefings so brief I barely remembered them. Humans were a newly discovered species from a system far beyond our usual patrol routes, a footnote in a database filled with thousands of other footnotes. Nobody on this bridge, myself included, had expected that footnote to become anything more than background information we would never think about again. "Hail them," Drayor ordered. Kala's fingers moved across his console, and a moment later the comm channel opened. Silence answered us. Not the silence of a channel gone dead, but the silence of someone choosing not to speak, choosing to let the quiet stretch out and grow heavier with every passing second. "Try again," Drayor said, and her voice had lost a fraction of its earlier calm. The second hail brought the same result. No response, no acknowledgement, not even the courtesy of a rejection. The ship simply sat there in the dark, engines idle, doing absolutely nothing at all, and somehow that nothing felt louder than any threat we had ever received. I found myself staring at the shape of that small grey vessel, and feeling something I could not name. It was not fear exactly, not yet. It was closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of a cliff in complete darkness, unable to see the bottom, unable to know how far the fall might be, and yet certain that the fall existed all the same. Could this be some kind of probe? Asked Officer Talis Doreen, our young navigation specialist, her voice carrying the hopeful edge of someone who wanted a simple explanation. An automated vessel testing our border defenses? "Life signs confirm a living occupant," Kala repeated. "This is not automated." Then why would a single living being fly an unarmed ship into contested space and refuse to answer our hails? Drayor asked the question to the room at large, but nobody offered an answer, because nobody had one. I glanced at the tactical display again, running my own scan across the vessel's hull for anything Kala might have missed. The metal looked ordinary, almost crude, compared to the elegant curves of assembly shipbuilding. There were no elaborate markings, no ceremonial insignias, nothing that suggested pride or display. It looked functional, in a way that unsettled me more than decoration ever could have. A species that built ships without concern for appearance was a species that valued something else entirely, and I did not know what that something else might be. "Distance to the border checkpoint?" Dryor asked. 12,000 kilometers and closing, ma'am, but the closing speed is minimal. At this rate it will take nearly 2 hours before it reaches the checkpoint itself. 2 hours. I did not know whether that time would feel long or impossibly short. I glanced sideways at Kala and saw the same uncertainty reflected on his face, the same question sitting unanswered behind his eyes. "What do you do with a threat that refuses to behave like a threat?" Commander Dryor turned from the view screen and looked around the bridge, studying each of our faces in turn, gathering whatever information she could from our reactions before making her decision. I straightened under her gaze, forcing my expression into something steady, something that would not betray the unease sitting heavy in my chest. "Continue hailing on all frequencies," she said finally. "Full sensor sweep, every possible spectrum. I want to know everything about that ship before it reaches the checkpoint. And someone contact Assembly Command. They need to know a new species has crossed our border without warning." The bridge exploded into quiet, efficient motion, officers moving through their tasks with practiced precision, even as an undercurrent of nervous energy ran beneath every action. I turned back to my own console and began cross-referencing everything we had on file about the species called human, searching for any scrap of information that might tell us what kind of mind was piloting that ship toward us. The records were thin. A handful of reports from scout vessels that had briefly detected human transmissions from the edges of their space, describing a species with a homeworld orbiting a single star, biologically similar to several other known species in general shape, though details on physical capability were sparse and mostly speculative. There was nothing about their military strength, nothing about their weapons, nothing about their history beyond a note that their system showed signs of significant industrial activity across multiple worlds in a relatively short span of time. That last detail caught my attention and refused to let go. Most species expanded slowly, cautiously, taking centuries to move beyond their home system as they weighed the risks and rewards of each new step. The notation suggested humans had done something different, something faster, though the report offered no explanation for how or why. I looked up from my console toward the view screen again, watching that small gray ship drift closer through the dark. It did not accelerate. It did not deviate from its course. It moved the way a swimmer moves through still water, unhurried, certain of its destination, untroubled by whatever waited for it at the end of the journey. "Ma'am," Kala said suddenly, his voice tight. "I am reading a transmission, weak signal, but it is coming from the human vessel." The bridge went silent. Drador stepped closer to the comm station. "Play it." The sound that came through the speakers was not what I expected. I do not know what I expected, honestly. Something mechanical, perhaps, or something aggressive, a warning or a demand. What we heard instead was a single voice, calm, measured, speaking in a language our translation systems struggled to parse in real time. The computer worked through it in fragments, piecing together meaning from a vocabulary it was still learning. "This is Envoy Ethan Marsh, representing the human systems. I have entered your declared border space to establish contact. I carry no weapons and pose no threat to your vessel or your people. I request a meeting with your ranking officer." The words settled over the bridge like a weight none of us had been prepared to carry. An envoy, a diplomat, alone, unarmed, in a ship with no shields and no weapons, crossing into territory belonging to a species with a long and violent history of dealing harshly with the unfamiliar. Either this Ethan Marsh did not understand the danger he had placed himself in, or he understood it completely and had decided it did not matter. "Respond," Dryor said. "Standard diplomatic protocol. Instruct him to hold position at the checkpoint boundary and await escort." Kala's fingers moved across the console, sending our reply into the dark. We waited. The response came almost immediately, the same calm voice, the same unhurried certainty. Understood. I will hold position. And that was all. No questions, no negotiation, no attempt to press for more than what he had been given. The ship slowed and, precisely at the boundary line our sensors marked as the edge of controlled space, it stopped moving entirely, engines powering down to the barest minimum required to maintain position. I studied the readings on my console, trying to understand what I was looking at. Every instinct I had built over 6 years of service told me this should feel like a victory, like the human had simply obeyed our authority the moment we asserted it. But that was not the feeling sitting in my chest. It felt instead like watching someone walk calmly into a room full of predators, because they were entirely confident nothing in that room could hurt them. "Commander," I said, surprising myself by speaking without being asked. Draur turned toward me, and I continued before I lost the nerve. Something about this does not sit right with me. A single unarmed envoy does not cross a hostile border and then wait patiently for us to decide his fate, unless he already believes he has nothing to fear from us. Draur studied me for a long moment, and I could not read what was behind her eyes. Or, she said finally, he understands exactly what fear he should feel, and has decided to hide it well. Either way, Officer Vesson, we will find out soon enough. She turned back to the view screen, and I followed her gaze toward that small gray ship sitting motionless at the edge of our space, its solitary pilot waiting inside, with a patience that felt less like courage and more like certainty. I did not know which possibility frightened me more. During the quiet stretch of time before Assembly Command responded, I found myself reviewing every scrap of visual data our sensors had gathered on the human vessel, searching for anything that might offer some clue about the mind piloting it. The hull bore a small marking near its forward section, simple lettering in a script our translation systems rendered as a series of characters, spelling out a single word that meant, according to the best interpretation available, something close to patience or endurance, though the translation carried enough uncertainty that I hesitated to place too much weight on it. I mentioned the marking to Officer Kella, who studied it for a long moment through his own console, before offering a quiet observation that stayed with me long after that shift ended. "Perhaps it is simply the name of the vessel," he said. "Though I admit, given everything else about this encounter, I find myself wondering whether it was chosen deliberately, as though someone wanted us to understand something about their approach before we ever exchanged a single word." I did not have an answer for him, though the thought lingered uncomfortably in the back of my mind as I continued my review of the sensor data. Every additional detail I uncovered seemed to deepen the mystery rather than resolve it. The vessel carried enough fuel reserves for a journey considerably longer than the distance between our checkpoint and the nearest known human territory, suggesting either an inefficient design or a deliberate choice to prepare for extended delays. Its life support systems showed capacity for a single occupant to remain aboard comfortably for many months without resupply, a detail that struck me as an unusual precaution for what should have been, by any reasonable expectation, a brief diplomatic visit. "He came prepared to wait," I said aloud, more to myself than to anyone else on the bridge, though Kalla glanced up from his own station at the observation, not for a quick exchange, for however long this required. Commander Draor, who had been listening from her position near the tactical display, turned toward us with an expression that suggested she had reached a similar conclusion through her own review of the data. "A patient envoy," she said quietly, "sent by a patient people. I am not certain whether that should reassure us or concern us further, Officer Vesson." I did not have an answer for her either, and the question remained unresolved in my thoughts as we continued waiting for instructions from Assembly Command, the small gray ship still hanging motionless in the dark beyond our view screen, its lone occupant offering no further hint of what he truly intended beyond that first calm, measured request for a meeting with whoever commanded our vessel. Assembly Command responded within the hour, their reply flashing across our secure channel with the kind of speed that told me they understood the significance of what had happened even before we finished explaining it. The order was clear, and it left no room for debate. We were to treat this as a matter requiring immediate demonstration of Assembly strength, a chance to establish, from this very first contact, exactly where the balance of power would sit between our peoples and this newly discovered species. I read the order twice, feeling the shape of it settle uneasily in my stomach. Assembly Command had built its reputation across 1,000 worlds on the principle that fear kept the peace better than diplomacy ever could. Every species that had joined the assembly in the last century had done so only after witnessing exactly what happened to those who resisted. It was not cruelty for its own sake, or so I had always told myself. It was efficiency. A single clear demonstration prevented centuries of costly conflict. But something about applying that principle to a lone envoy who had done nothing but ask for a meeting felt different from every other case I had studied in training. This was not a rebellious colony refusing to pay tribute. This was not a hostile fleet testing our borders with weapons drawn. This was one person, unarmed, waiting quietly for whatever we decided to do with him. I looked around the bridge and saw my own unease mirrored on several other faces, though nobody spoke it aloud. Commander Dror read the order from Assembly Command with an expression carved from stone, giving nothing away, and when she finally looked up, her voice carried the flat certainty of someone who had already decided there was no use arguing with instructions from far above her rank. "Prepare a boarding pod," she said. "We will show this envoy exactly what waits for those who enter assembly space without proper respect." Nobody on the bridge asked what that meant. Nobody needed to. We all understood exactly what the order implied, and I felt a cold weight settle into my chest as Kala relayed the command down through the ship, setting into motion something I already suspected none of us were prepared to fully understand. I turned my gaze back toward the view screen one final time before returning to my station, watching that small gray ship hang silently in the dark, its lone occupant waiting inside with no idea, or perhaps every idea, of what was coming for him. The 2 hours we had been given to study this new threat suddenly felt like no time at all, and somewhere beneath my training and my discipline, a quiet voice kept whispering that we were about to learn something about ourselves as much as we were about to learn something about them. Word spread through the ship faster than any official announcement could travel, the way important news always does aboard a vessel this size. By the time I reached the lower observation deck to catch my breath before my next shift, I could already hear murmurs among the crew, quiet conversations that stopped the moment I walked past. Everyone knew what a boarding pod launch meant. Everyone had heard stories, some of them true, most of them exaggerated with retelling, about what happened to those who received a visit from the operative housed 3 decks below us in a chamber few were ever permitted to enter. I had seen him only once, years earlier, during a ceremony honoring exceptional service. He had stood apart from the rest of us, silent, still, his presence somehow making the entire room feel smaller. His name was Corveth, though few used it, preferring instead the title given to his kind by those who feared them most. The Silent Hand, a weapon shaped from a person, trained from birth to feel nothing when the moment demanded stillness of the heart. I remembered the way conversation had died around him that day, the way even senior officers had kept a careful distance, as though proximity alone might mark them for something unpleasant. Now that same operative was being summoned to deal with a single unarmed envoy waiting patiently at the edge of our declared space, and the thought of it left an uncomfortable knot lodged somewhere beneath my ribs. I told myself this was simply protocol, simply the assembly doing what it always did to protect its authority, but the reasoning felt thinner each time I repeated it to myself. I made my way back toward the bridge, passing through corridors that had grown quieter than usual, as if the entire ship was holding its breath along with me. When I arrived, Commander Dreor stood near the tactical display, reviewing readiness reports from the boarding team, with the same unreadable expression she had worn since receiving the order from Assembly Command. "Pod is fueled and ready," Kala reported from his station. "Corvette has been briefed and is proceeding to the launch bay." Dreor nodded once, offering no further comment, and I found myself wondering whether her silence came from confidence in the coming outcome, or from the same unease that had settled over the rest of us like a fog we could not quite name. I wanted to ask her directly, wanted to know if she felt what I felt standing there, but rank and discipline kept the question locked behind my teeth. I turned my attention to the view screen instead, watching the small gray ship hold its position exactly where it had stopped hours before. Nothing about it had changed. No new activity registered on our sensors, No hidden systems powering to life in response to our preparations. The vessel simply waited, as still and patient as it had been since the moment it first appeared, and something about that unwavering stillness felt far more unsettling than any show of aggression could have been. Envoy Marsh remains stationary, Calla confirmed, his voice quieter now, as though he too had begun to feel the weight pressing down on the bridge. No change in his transmissions. He has made no further requests since agreeing to hold position. I thought about that lone figure sitting inside his small ship, waiting for whatever we chose to send his way, and I wondered what kind of mind allowed a person to remain that calm in the face of such uncertainty. Either he trusted something about his own situation that we could not see from where we stood, or he had simply resigned himself to whatever came next, with a stillness that mirrored the very weapon we were sending against him. The launch bay reported readiness a short while later, and Commander Draor gave the final authorization without hesitation, her voice steady, even as the rest of us exchanged glances heavy with things none of us dared to say aloud. I watched the tactical display shift, marking the boarding pod's trajectory as it detached from our hull and began its slow, deliberate approach toward the waiting human vessel. Whatever answers we were searching for, whatever balance of power Assembly Command hoped to establish through this single demonstration, I understood in that moment that we were no longer simply observers of these events. We had become participants in something none of us fully understood, and there was no way to call the pod back now that it had already begun its silent journey across the dark toward the ship of a species we had learned to fear before we had learned a single true thing about them. The feed from Corveth's helmet activated on the bridge the moment the boarding pod sealed its connection to the human vessel's outer hull, and every officer present turned toward the display as though pulled by the same invisible thread. I found myself holding my breath without meaning to, watching the grainy image sway slightly as the pod's door hissed open, revealing a narrow airlock beyond that looked nothing like what I expected from a species capable of building starships. Corveth moved through the opening with the fluid economy of someone who had performed this exact motion countless times before. His steps made almost no sound, even through the sensitive pickup built into his suit, and the silence of his movement felt somehow louder than footsteps ever could have been. I had read his service record once, years earlier, during a training module on assembly enforcement history. 43 confirmed operations, 0 failures, 0 witnesses left behind to describe what happened in the rooms he entered. The instructors had presented these numbers with something close to pride, as though the absence of survivors was itself a form of mercy, a clean and quick resolution rather than a prolonged conflict. I remembered one operation described in careful, clinical language during that same training session, an incident at a rebel outpost on the edge of contested territory. An entire garrison, silenced within minutes, no alarms raised beyond the first, no distress signal completed before it was cut short. The instructors had called it efficient. I had called it, in the privacy of my own thoughts, something closer to a nightmare, given a uniform and a purpose. On the display, Corveth reached the interior door leading deeper into the human vessel, his hand resting against a control panel that looked crude compared to the elegant systems built into assembly ships. The door slid open with a low mechanical groan, and beyond it stretched a narrow corridor lit by simple strips of pale light running along the ceiling. Everything about the ship's construction spoke of function over form, purpose over pride, and I found myself studying every detail as Corveth advanced, searching for anything that might explain the strange confidence carried by the single occupant waiting somewhere ahead of him. Life sign remains stationary, Calla reported quietly, reading from a secondary feed relayed through Corveth's suit sensors. Cargo hold, deck 2, distance approximately 40 meters. Commander Draor said nothing, her eyes fixed on the display with an intensity that made the rest of the bridge fall into an uneasy hush. I glanced at her briefly before returning my own attention to the feed, watching Corveth move through the corridor with unhurried precision, each step measured, each motion calculated to leave no wasted energy behind. The ship's interior offered few clues about the people who built it. No decoration lined the walls, no markings suggested rank or ceremony, nothing hinted at culture or history, the way even the simplest assembly vessels always did. It felt almost abandoned, despite the presence of a single living being somewhere within its hull, and that emptiness pressed against my thoughts in a way I could not fully explain. I thought back to a conversation I had overheard years earlier between two senior officers discussing the program that produced operatives like Corveth, a conversation I had not been meant to hear and had never repeated to anyone since. They spoke of a facility hidden somewhere within Assembly Corps territory, a place where selected children were raised apart from ordinary society, under conditions designed to strip away every instinct toward hesitation or mercy, replacing those instincts with something colder and more absolute. I remembered feeling a quiet horror at the time, quickly buried beneath the comfortable assumption that such methods, however uncomfortable to consider, ultimately served the greater peace that assembly enforcement provided across 1,000 worlds. Watching Corveth move now through that narrow human corridor, his every motion honed by exactly that kind of merciless training, I found myself questioning, for the first time in years, whether the peace such methods purchased was worth the price paid to produce the instrument that maintained it. Corveth reached a junction where the corridor split in two directions, and for the first time since boarding, he paused. The pause lasted only a heartbeat, barely long enough to notice, but I noticed it all the same, because operatives like him did not pause without reason. His sensors swept briefly across both paths before he chose the one leading toward the cargo hold, resuming his advance with the same fluid certainty as before. "Approaching target location," Kala said, his voice tightening slightly with each word. I watched the display shift as Corveth stepped through a final doorway into a wide, open space, lined with empty storage racks along both walls. The room was bare, except for a single figure standing near its center, facing the entrance directly, as though he had been waiting there since the moment the boarding pod first made contact with the hull. The image resolved with painful clarity. Envoy Ethan Marsh stood without any visible weapon, without armor, without even the posture of someone bracing for confrontation. He wore simple clothing, dark and unremarkable, and his hands hung loosely at his sides, in a manner that suggested neither aggression nor fear. His face carried an expression I struggled to interpret through the imperfect quality of the feed, something closer to patience than anything else, as though he had been expecting this exact moment for quite some time. "He is not attempting to flee," Talis Doreen whispered from her station, though nobody had asked for that observation aloud. I understood why she said it anyway. None of us could quite believe what we were watching. Corveth advanced another few steps into the room, his posture shifting subtly into something more purposeful, more prepared. I recognized the change from descriptions I had read in old reports, the slight adjustment operatives like him made in the moments before initiating direct action. My chest tightened as I watched, some part of me hoping, without any logical reason to hope, that this confrontation might resolve itself differently than every previous story I had ever heard about the Silent Hand. "Envoy Marsh," Corveth said through his suit's translator, his voice flat and utterly without warmth. "You have entered assembly space without proper authorization. You will be made an example." The words hung in the air of that bare cargo hold, and I watched Ethan Marsh's expression shift, though not in the direction I expected. There was no fear in his face, no desperate calculation of escape routes, nothing that resembled the reactions described in every account I had ever studied about targets facing an operative like Corveth. Instead, something almost like mild curiosity crossed his features, the look of a person observing an interesting but ultimately unsurprising development. "I understand," Marsh said simply, his voice carrying clearly through the feed despite its quiet tone. "I expected something like this might happen." I felt a chill move through me at those words, though I could not immediately name why. Expected. He had expected this, had perhaps anticipated exactly this scenario before he ever crossed our border, and yet he had come anyway, alone, unarmed, with nothing standing between himself and whatever consequence we chose to deliver. Corveth drew his weapon in a single smooth motion, the molecular blade he carried unfolding from its housing with a soft mechanical whir that I had heard described in reports but never witnessed firsthand. The edge of that blade represented decades of assembly engineering, refined across generations to guarantee absolute lethal efficiency in a single decisive strike. No target had ever survived contact with it. No target had ever come close. On the bridge, nobody spoke. I felt my own pulse hammering against my throat as I watched the display, watched Corveth take a final measured step forward, closing the distance between himself and the man who stood waiting, with an expression that still refused to match anything I understood about fear. "Last opportunity to submit," Corveth said, his voice as empty as ever, carrying no threat because it required none. The blade alone carried every threat that needed speaking. Ethan Marsh tilted his head slightly, studying the weapon with something that looked almost like polite interest rather than terror, and when he spoke again, his voice remained as calm and measured as it had been from the very first transmission we received hours earlier. "I heard you the first time," he said. "I am simply waiting to see what happens next." I did not understand what he meant by those words, not in that moment, standing on the bridge with my hands gripping the edge of my console, tightly enough to feel the metal biting into my palms. Commander Dreor leaned forward slightly, her stillness finally breaking into something sharper, more focused, as though some instinct buried deep within her had begun to whisper that this confrontation was not unfolding the way every previous demonstration of assembly authority had unfolded before. Corvett's blade caught the pale light of the cargo hold as he raised it, and for one suspended moment, the entire bridge seemed to hold its breath together, waiting to witness the outcome that every one of us, deep down, already believed we knew. I watched the feed with my heart pounding, unable to look away, unable to fully process the strange stillness radiating from the man standing directly in the path of a weapon that had never once failed to end whatever life it was aimed toward. Beside me, Officer Ren Kalla had gone completely still, his fingers hovering above his console, without pressing anything at all, as though some part of him understood that nothing he could type would change what was about to happen on that screen. I glanced at him briefly and saw my own tension mirrored in the tight line of his jaw, in the way his eyes refused to blink for fear of missing even a fraction of a second. Commander Dreor had not moved from her position near the tactical display since the confrontation began, but I noticed something shift in her posture during those final moments, a subtle straightening of her shoulders that I recognized from every difficult decision I had watched her make over the years. She was preparing herself for an outcome, though I could not tell whether she expected the outcome any of us had assumed from the very beginning, or whether some part of her had already begun to suspect something different entirely. I thought about the reports I had read on Corveth's service history, the careful clinical language used to describe outcomes that never varied, operations that always concluded exactly as intended. 43 confirmed engagements. I found myself running that number through my mind again and again, as if repeating it might restore some of the certainty that had begun quietly draining out of the room since the moment Ethan Marsh spoke his first calm words back on that bridge feed hours earlier. The cargo hold on the display remained lit in that same pale, functional light, offering no shadows for either figure to hide within, no obstruction to soften whatever was about to unfold in full view of every officer watching from our bridge. I noticed, almost absently, that Marsh had not shifted his stance since Corveth first raised the blade. His feet remained planted exactly where they had been, his hands still loose at his sides, his expression still carrying that same quiet, patient curiosity that had unsettled me from the very first moment I saw his face through the feed. "Why is he not moving?" Talis Doreen whispered again, her voice barely audible over the low hum of the bridge systems around us. I did not have an answer for her, and judging by the silence that followed, nobody else did either. I found myself thinking, in that strange suspended moment, about the very first briefing I had ever received on the Assembly's enforcement doctrine, delivered by an instructor whose name I had long since forgotten. She had told us that fear worked, because it removed choice from those who felt it, that a frightened mind stopped calculating and simply reacted, fleeing or freezing or begging, because that was what fear was built to do. I had believed her completely at the time, had built years of service around that single principle without ever questioning it. But nothing about the man standing in that cargo hold matched what I had been taught to expect from someone facing an unstoppable weapon. There was no freezing born of panic in his stillness. There was no fleeing in his silence. If anything, his stillness looked deliberate, chosen rather than imposed, and that distinction, small as it seemed in the moment, sat uneasily in the back of my mind, Like a splinter, I could not quite work free. Corveth's posture shifted once more, weight settling low and balanced, the blade held with the kind of precision that came only from decades of relentless training. I had heard once, in a story passed quietly between junior officers late at night, that operatives like him were selected before they could walk, taken from families who were told only that their child had been chosen for great purpose, never informed of what that purpose actually required. I did not know if the story was true. I had never wanted to ask anyone who might have known for certain. On the display, the blade rose fully into position, catching the pale overhead light along its molecular edge in a thin, bright line that seemed to cut the very air around it. I felt my breath catch somewhere in my chest, and beside me, I heard Kala exhale slowly through his teeth, the sound barely audible, but somehow enormous, in the silence that had settled over the entire bridge. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Every officer present seemed to understand, without needing to say it aloud, that we were about to witness something that would be discussed and analyzed and repeated in briefings for years to come, whichever way it concluded. I gripped the edge of my console tightly enough that my knuckles ached, my eyes fixed on the frozen shape of Ethan Marsh standing calm and unmoving in the path of a weapon that had never once, in its long and documented history, failed to end whatever stood before it. The blade began its descent, and somewhere in the back of my mind, beneath the training and the discipline that had shaped 6 years of my service, that same quiet voice from earlier returned, whispering with a certainty I could not silence, telling me that whatever happened in the next few seconds would change something far larger than the fate of a single unarmed envoy standing alone in a bare and empty room. The blade never reached its mark. I saw it happen, and yet some part of my mind refused to accept what my eyes reported, running the moment back and forth as though searching for an error in the feed itself. Ethan Marsh's hand moved, not with panic, not with the frantic desperation of someone trying to save their own life, but with a calm, almost lazy precision, closing around the descending blade as though catching a falling leaf rather than a weapon engineered across generations to end life in a single decisive stroke. The bridge fell into a silence so complete I could hear my own pulse hammering in my ears. Nobody spoke, nobody breathed, or so it seemed in that frozen fraction of a second, as every officer present stared at the display in a state of disbelief that felt almost physical, a pressure pressing down against my chest and refusing to lift. Corveth did not move. For the first time since I had ever seen footage of him in action, the operative stood completely still, his blade held fast in the grip of a man who should have been lying motionless on the floor of that cargo hold, whose blood should have already begun spreading across the pale metal beneath him. Instead, Marsh stood exactly where he had been standing before, his expression unchanged, his grip on the blade steady and sure, as though he had simply reached out to accept a handshake rather than intercept a killing blow. "That is not possible," Kala whispered beside me, his voice cracking slightly on the final word. I could not offer him any correction, because I shared his disbelief completely, my mind scrambling to find some explanation that made sense within everything I had been taught about the world and the creatures who lived within it. On the display, Marsh's fingers tightened slightly around the blade, and I watched, still barely believing what I was seeing, as no visible harm registered on his hand at all. No injury, no mark. Nothing that suggested the molecular edge, capable of cutting through reinforced assembly armor plating without resistance, had done anything to the flesh gripping it now. Commander Dreor took a single step closer to the display, her arms unfolding from where they had been crossed against her chest since the confrontation began. Her voice, when it finally came, sounded thinner than I had ever heard it, stripped of the composed authority she carried through every other crisis I had witnessed her navigate. "Magnify the feed. I want a clear reading on that hand." Kala's fingers moved quickly across his console, and the image on the display sharpened, bringing Marsh's hand into clearer focus. I studied it as closely as the resolution allowed, searching for some hidden device, some piece of concealed technology that might explain what we were witnessing. I found nothing. It looked like an ordinary hand, unremarkable in every visible way, closed firmly around a blade that should have already sliced clean through it. Corveth's posture had shifted into something I had never seen from him before, something that, on any other person, I might have described as hesitation. His weight had settled backward slightly, his balance no longer carrying the fluid confidence that defined every recorded moment of his service. I found myself staring at that small, almost imperceptible change, understanding with a chill that ran straight through my chest that I was watching something break inside a man, built specifically to never break at all. "Report," Dreyor said sharply, though I was not certain who she expected to answer, since nobody on the bridge had any explanation to offer. "No change in life signs from either individual," Kala said, his voice unsteady as he read from his console. "Envoy Marsh registers no physical distress. No elevated stress indicators. Heart rate remains within what our translation database estimates as a calm baseline for his species." Calm. The word landed strangely in that tense silence, because nothing about the situation should have permitted calm from anyone standing in that cargo hold, and yet the sensors insisted it was true. I looked back at the display and saw Marsh's face still carrying that same quiet, patient expression, as though the blade gripped tightly in his fist was nothing more than a minor inconvenience interrupting whatever thoughts occupied his mind. I thought, in that strange suspended moment, about every story I had ever heard regarding the Silent Hands missions, every clinical report describing swift and absolute conclusions. None of those stories had prepared me for this. None of the training modules, none of the briefings, none of the quiet conversations shared between junior officers late at night had ever suggested that such a moment was even possible. Corveth attempted to withdraw the blade, and I watched his shoulder shift with the effort, a subtle strain visible even through the limited resolution of the feed. The blade did not move. Marsh's grip held it exactly in place, as immovable as though it had been fixed there by something far stronger than a single closed hand should have been capable of producing. "He is not releasing it," Talis Doreen said quietly, stating the obvious because none of us seemed capable of processing anything beyond the plainest description of what was unfolding before us. Marsh's gaze shifted, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he looked directly toward the small recording device built into Corveth's suit, the very lens transmitting this entire scene back to our bridge. I felt an uncomfortable chill settle over me at that look, because it carried an unmistakable awareness, a clear understanding that he was not simply speaking to the operative standing before him, but to every officer watching from somewhere far beyond that cargo hold. "I appreciate the demonstration," Marsh said, his voice carrying the same calm, measured tone it had held from the very beginning. "I needed to understand what your people considered a serious threat before we continued this conversation." The words settled over the bridge with a weight I struggled to fully comprehend. A demonstration. He had described the deployment of our most feared and lethal operative as a demonstration, something to be observed and assessed rather than survived through desperate effort. I glanced toward Commander Dreyor and saw her expression had shifted into something I had rarely witnessed from her, a flicker of uncertainty breaking through the careful composure she maintained through every other crisis. Corveth remained frozen, his blade still held fast within Marsh's grip, and I found myself studying the operative's posture for any sign of what he might do next. Every instinct I possessed, built from years of studying his service record, told me that a person like Corveth did not simply accept failure without further action, that some deeper protocol must exist for exactly this kind of unprecedented situation. And yet he stood there, unmoving, as though his training had never once accounted for the possibility that his blade might simply fail to do what it had always done before. "Should we recall him?" Kala asked quietly, directing the question toward Dreyor without taking his eyes off the display. Dreyor did not answer immediately. I watched her study the frozen tableau on the screen, watched her weigh whatever calculations were running through her mind in that critical moment, and I understood, without needing to be told, that whatever decision she made next would carry consequences reaching far beyond this single confrontation. "Not yet," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady once more. "Let us see what he intends to do." I turned my attention back to the display, watching Ethan Marsh stand perfectly still, with an assembly blade gripped fast in his hand, his expression carrying no fear, no anger, nothing beyond that same quiet, patient curiosity he had shown from the very moment Corveth first entered that bare and empty cargo hold. Whatever certainty I had carried into this shift Whatever understanding I believed I possessed about the balance of power between the assembly and the rest of the galaxy had begun crumbling apart in front of me, piece by piece, with every second that ticked past in that impossible, suspended silence. Corvith's free hand moved slowly toward a secondary weapon housed along his hip, a compact sidearm designed as backup for situations where the blade alone proved insufficient, though I had never once heard of a mission requiring its use. I watched the motion with a strange, detached fascination, some part of my mind still struggling to reconcile the operative's hesitation with everything I thought I understood about him. Marsh's eyes tracked the movement without any visible alarm, and when he spoke again, his tone carried something almost gentle, the way someone might address a child reaching for a task beyond their current ability. "I would not recommend that," he said simply. "It will not change the outcome, and I would prefer we avoid further escalation before we have even had the chance to speak properly." Corvett's hand paused above the sidearm, and I watched the operative's head tilt slightly, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone not studying the feed as intently as every person on our bridge currently was. It was the first sign of genuine deliberation I had ever witnessed from him, the first indication that some calculation beyond pure trained instinct was working through his mind in that moment. "Report your status," Dryor said into the comm, her voice carrying an edge of urgency that had not been present moments before. "Corveth, respond." A long pause followed before the operative's voice finally came through, and when it did, it carried none of the flat, emotionless certainty that had defined every previous word I had ever heard him speak. "Target has neutralized primary weapon function," he said slowly, each word measured as though he were working through an entirely unfamiliar process of reporting failure aloud, awaiting further instruction. I had never heard an operative like Corveth request instruction mid-engagement. Every account I had ever studied described operatives acting entirely on their own judgment once deployed, trusted completely to resolve any situation without needing guidance from command. The fact that he was asking now told me, more clearly than anything else that had happened in that cargo hold, exactly how far outside every expectation this confrontation had already traveled. Drower exchanged a brief glance with her second-in-command, a silent conversation passing between them that I could not fully interpret from where I stood. When she spoke again, her voice had steadied, though I could still hear the strain beneath it. "Withdraw. Return to the ship immediately." On the display, Corveth attempted once more to pull the blade free, his full strength visibly engaged this time, his stance shifting into something more forceful, more determined. The blade did not move even a fraction of an inch within Marsh's grip. I watched the muscles along the operative's arms strain against the resistance, watched his boots scrape slightly against the metal floor as he pulled with everything his considerable training had built into his body, and still nothing changed. Marsh released the blade himself, finally, opening his fingers with the same unhurried calm that had characterized every action he had taken since Corveth first entered that room. The sudden release sent Corveth stumbling backward a single step, catching himself quickly, though I noticed the way his balance faltered for just a moment before he recovered his composure. "You may return to your ship," Marsh said, his voice carrying no triumph, no satisfaction at having disarmed one of the most feared weapons in assembly history. If anything, his tone sounded almost sympathetic, the way someone might speak to a person who had simply been given an impossible task through no fault of their own. "I have no wish to cause further difficulty for you personally. My concerns lie elsewhere." Corveth did not respond immediately. He stood there for a long moment, his blade still clutched uselessly in his hand, studying the man before him with an intensity that I imagined must have been the closest thing to genuine confusion that his rigorous training had ever permitted him to express. Then, without another word, he turned and began making his way back toward the airlock, his steps carrying none of the fluid confidence that had marked his advance only minutes earlier. On the bridge, nobody spoke for what felt like a very long time. I looked around at the faces of my fellow officers and saw the same stunned disbelief reflected in each of them, the same struggle to process an outcome that fell so completely outside everything our training had ever prepared us to expect. Thalis Doreen had one hand pressed against her mouth, her eyes still fixed on the display even though Corveth had already left the cargo hold behind. Kalla sat frozen at his station, his fingers resting motionless above controls he no longer seemed to know how to use. Commander Drayor turned away from the view screen slowly, and when she finally spoke, her voice had regained some of its earlier composure, though I could still hear the effort it cost her to keep it steady. "Get me a direct line to Assembly Command," she said. "They need to know exactly what just happened here, and they need to know it before any other decisions are made regarding this species." Talis Doreen finally lowered her hand from where it had been pressed against her mouth throughout much of the confrontation, and when she spoke, her voice carried a rawness that surprised me, given how composed she usually remained during difficult moments. "I keep waiting for someone to tell me this was some kind of trick," she said. "Some hidden technology we simply failed to detect. Because the alternative, that a single person simply withstood that blade through nothing more than their own body, feels like something I do not know how to accept." I understood her difficulty completely, because I had spent the last several minutes wrestling with exactly the same resistance in my own thoughts. Our sensors were sophisticated instruments, calibrated to detect even the faintest energy signature, the subtlest hidden device, and they had found nothing beyond an ordinary hand belonging to an ordinary-looking man. The absence of any technological explanation felt, in its own way, more unsettling than any hidden device could have been, because it left only the far stranger possibility that Ethan Marsh's own body had simply proven sufficient to withstand what our most advanced weapon had been engineered across generations to guarantee against any target. Commander Drayor moved slowly back toward her command chair, lowering herself into it with the careful deliberation of someone whose legs had only just remembered how to support her properly after several minutes of frozen tension. She said nothing for a long moment, staring at the now empty display where the feed from Corveth's helmet had cut to static the moment he stepped back through the airlock into his returning pod. "Compile everything," she finally said, her voice quiet but carrying clearly across the hushed bridge. "Every sensor reading, every frame of footage, every physiological indicator we recorded from both individuals throughout the entire encounter. I want a complete record prepared before Assembly Command asks for one, because I suspect they will be asking within the hour." I turned to my console and began the work she had requested, my hands moving through familiar procedures even as my mind continued circling back to the image of that blade, held motionless in a bare, unprotected hand. I had joined assembly service believing, as every cadet believed, in the fundamental correctness of the order we maintained across 1,000 worlds, an order built on the certain knowledge that sufficient force, properly demonstrated, resolved every serious dispute before it could grow into something worse. That certainty had carried me through 6 years of service without ever requiring serious examination, a comfortable foundation I had rarely thought to question. Now, compiling sensor data from an encounter that had unfolded in complete defiance of everything that certainty had promised me, I found myself understanding, for the first time, how thin that foundation had actually been all along, resting not on any universal law of the galaxy, but on the simple, unexamined assumption that nothing capable of resisting it would ever choose to arrive at our door and calmly wait to be tested. I remained at my station, my mind still turning over everything I had just witnessed, searching for some framework that might help me understand it. Every principle I had been taught about power and fear and the natural order of dominance among the stars had just been challenged by a single unarmed man standing calmly in a bare cargo hold, and I did not yet know what to do with the unsettling new understanding beginning to take root somewhere deep within my thoughts. In the immediate aftermath of Corveth's return, the bridge settled into an unusual quiet, the kind that follows any event too large to process quickly, where every officer present seemed to retreat briefly into their own private thoughts before finding the words to speak aloud. I watched Commander Draor move between stations, checking readiness reports and status updates with the same methodical thoroughness she always brought to her duties, though I noticed a slight hesitation in her movements that had not been present before the confrontation began, as though some part of her was still working through the implications of what we had just witnessed, even as she continued attending to routine responsibilities. Corveth himself did not return immediately to active duty following his withdrawal from the human vessel. I learned, through a brief update passed along by the ship's medical officer, that he had been placed under standard post-engagement observation, a protocol typically reserved for operatives who had sustained physical injury during a mission rather than the kind of psychological uncertainty his file now presumably contained. I wondered, standing at my station during that quiet stretch of waiting, what exactly such an observation period looked like for someone whose entire existence had been shaped around the assumption that failure of the kind he had just experienced was simply not possible. Kala broke the silence between us eventually, his voice quieter than usual as he spoke without looking away from his console. "Do you think Assembly Command will send someone else?" he asked. "Another operative, perhaps, or something else entirely, to finish what Corvith could not?" I considered the question seriously before answering, turning over everything I had witnessed in the preceding hours. "I do not think another operative would produce a different outcome," I said finally. Whatever allowed Marsh to withstand that blade did not depend on Corvith specifically failing in some way that a different operative might avoid. "I suspect any weapon we sent would meet the same result." Kala absorbed that assessment with a slow nod, though I could see the discomfort it produced in his expression. "Then what happens now?" he asked. "If our strongest response accomplishes nothing, what is left for us to do?" I did not have a satisfying answer for him in that moment, and the question remained hanging unanswered between us as we returned to our respective duties, waiting for whatever guidance Assembly Command would eventually provide. The connection to Assembly Command took longer than usual to establish, and I spent those long minutes standing quietly at my station, replaying the footage in my mind again and again, searching for some detail I might have missed that would restore the sense of order I had carried into this shift only hours earlier. Nothing came. The memory remained exactly as strange and unsettling as it had been the first time I witnessed it, a blade caught bare-handed by a man who showed no more concern than someone brushing dust from their sleeve. When the connection finally opened, the face that appeared on our secondary display belonged to High Overseer Renata Vol, a figure I had only ever seen during formal assembly broadcasts, never in direct communication with a vessel as modest in rank as ours. Her expression carried the same practiced neutrality I had come to associate with senior assembly leadership, though I noticed a tightness around her eyes that suggested she had already received a preliminary report before our own transmission reached her. "Commander Draor," Overseer Vol said, her voice carrying the clipped efficiency of someone accustomed to controlling every conversation she participated in. "I have reviewed the initial data feed from your engagement. I want a full account, directly from you, of everything that transpired." Draor delivered her report with careful precision, describing each moment of the confrontation in the same measured tone she used for every official communication, though I could hear the underlying strain still present beneath her professional composure. Overseer Vol listened without interruption, her expression remaining unreadable throughout the entire account, though her silence itself felt heavier with each passing second. When Draor finished, a long pause stretched across the connection before Vol finally spoke again. "This is unprecedented," she said slowly, and something about hearing that word from someone at her level of authority sent a fresh wave of unease through my chest. Assembly Command did not use words like unprecedented lightly. Their entire philosophy of governance depended on precedent, on the certainty that every situation had already been encountered and successfully resolved somewhere within their long and careful history. "Recommendations?" Draor asked simply, and I understood why she chose to ask rather than offer her own suggestions first. This situation had moved far beyond anything a single vessel commander could be expected to resolve independently. "Maintain current position," Vol said after another pause. "Do not engage further without direct authorization. I am convening a full council session to determine our response. In the meantime, keep the human vessel under continuous observation and report any change in status immediately." The connection closed, and I felt the tension on the bridge shift into something quieter, though no less heavy than before. Waiting for a distant council to determine a response felt like a strange kind of relief after the chaos of the previous hour, though I suspected the calm would not last long once word of what happened here began spreading through the wider assembly network. I did not have to wait long to be proven right. Within the hour, secondary reports began filtering through our communication systems, fragments of information suggesting that footage from Corveth's helmet feed had already reached beyond our immediate chain of command, circulating among other vessels stationed along the border, among officers who had no official reason to have seen it yet somehow had. I did not know how such things spread so quickly through supposedly secure channels, but they always did, and this time proved no exception. Kala approached my station quietly during a brief lull in our duties, his voice low enough that only I could hear him. "Do you think Assembly Command understands what they saw?" he asked, and I could hear genuine uncertainty behind the question, rather than simple idle curiosity. I considered the question carefully before answering. "I think they understand the footage," I said finally. "I am not certain anyone yet understands what it means." Kala nodded slowly, his eyes drifting back toward the main view screen where the small grey human vessel continued to sit motionless at the exact boundary line it had held since the very beginning of this entire encounter. "He is still just waiting there," Kala said. As if nothing happened at all, I followed his gaze and found the observation accurate. Nothing about the ship's position or behavior had changed in the aftermath of the confrontation. No triumphant departure, no attempt to press an advantage now that our most feared weapon had failed against him. Ethan Marsh simply continued waiting, exactly as he had been waiting since the moment his ship first crossed into our declared space, as though the entire encounter with Corveth had been nothing more than a minor formality he needed to complete before the conversation he actually wanted could begin. A new transmission arrived from the human vessel roughly 2 hours after Corveth's return, and the bridge fell into immediate attentive silence the moment Kala announced its arrival. Draur authorized the connection without hesitation, and Marsh's calm voice filled the bridge once more, carrying the same measured quality it had held throughout every previous communication. "I understand this encounter has raised significant questions among your leadership," he said. "I want to clarify my intentions clearly, so there is no continued uncertainty about why I am here. I did not come to threaten your people or to demonstrate superiority over your assembly. I came because my own leadership requires certain assurances before formal contact between our species can proceed, and unfortunately, those assurances required exactly the kind of encounter that occurred earlier today." Draur stepped closer to the comm station, her expression carefully controlled despite the obvious weight of the moment. "What assurances?" she asked directly, and I admired the steadiness in her voice, given everything we had witnessed only hours before. "Simple ones," Marsh replied. "We needed to understand exactly what capability your assembly considered its most serious deterrent, so that our diplomatic teams could accurately assess the nature of any future negotiation. I regret that the method required exposing your operative to an outcome that I understand may prove personally difficult for him." "That was never my intention." I found myself studying the small grey ship on the view screen as Marsh spoke, trying to reconcile the calm, almost apologetic tone of his words with the impossible strength he had displayed only hours earlier. If anything, he sounded genuinely concerned about the operative he had disarmed so effortlessly, and that concern unsettled me even more than the confrontation itself had. "You could have simply told us this," Draur said, a note of frustration finally breaking through her careful composure. "Instead, you allowed us to send an operative into a confrontation that placed both parties at risk." "Words alone would not have provided the assurance my leadership required," Marsh said, his tone remaining patient despite the edge in Draor's voice. "Your assembly has built its entire relationship with the wider galaxy around the credible threat of overwhelming force. We needed to understand the true shape of that force before deciding how seriously to weigh it in our own calculations. I recognize this may not have been the ideal introduction between our peoples, and for that, I offer a genuine apology." The bridge remained silent following his words, every officer present processing the strange combination of humility and quiet confidence carried in his voice. I found myself thinking that this was not the response I would have expected from someone who had just single-handedly dismantled our most terrifying deterrent without any visible effort at all. There was no boasting in his tone, no attempt to leverage the moment into further demands. He spoke instead like someone simply completing a necessary but unpleasant task, eager to move past it toward whatever genuine purpose had brought him here in the first place. "What do you actually want?" Draur asked finally, her voice quieter now, though no less direct than before. "A meeting," Marsh said simply. with representatives from your assembly leadership, conducted under proper diplomatic protocol, to discuss the terms under which our two peoples might begin a formal relationship. I am prepared to wait as long as necessary for that meeting to be arranged." I glanced toward Commander Dreor and saw her studying the view screen with an expression I could not fully read, some complicated mixture of caution and something that might have been the very beginning of respect, however reluctant. Whatever certainty any of us had carried into this encounter about the natural order between our assembly and the rest of the galaxy had already begun shifting into something far less settled, and I understood, standing there on that quiet bridge, that nothing about our relationship with the wider stars would ever return to exactly what it had been only hours before. Assembly Command took 3 full days to arrange the meeting Marsh had requested, and during that time, the small gray vessel never moved from its position at the boundary line, patient as a held breath, waiting exactly where it had stopped from the very first hour of contact. I remained assigned to bridge duty throughout most of that period, watching as increasingly senior officials arrived aboard shuttles to observe the situation firsthand, each of them carrying the same barely concealed unease that had settled over our own crew since the confrontation in the cargo hold. One such official, a mid-ranking strategist named Corin Halvain, spent considerable time reviewing our sensor logs alongside me during the second day, asking careful, probing questions about every detail of the encounter that our instruments had managed to capture. "The physiological readings trouble me most," he admitted at one point, studying the data displayed across my console with a furrowed brow. Every stress indicator we track remained within calm baseline throughout the entire encounter. Elevated heart rate would at least suggest effort, some cost paid for the resistance he demonstrated. This suggests instead that withstanding the blade cost him nothing at all, that it required no more exertion than any ordinary movement might have required. I had noticed the same detail during my own review of the footage, and hearing it spoken aloud by someone with considerably more strategic experience than myself only deepened the unease it had already produced in me. "What does that suggest to you?" I asked, curious whether his conclusion would match the uncomfortable thoughts I had been turning over privately during the preceding days. Halvain considered the question for a long moment before answering. "It suggests we witnessed something closer to a baseline capability than a maximum effort," he said finally, "which means we still do not know what a maximum effort from that species might actually look like. I find that considerably more concerning than anything a raised heart rate might have told us." I carried that assessment with me through the remainder of his visit, understanding that it captured precisely the uncertainty that continued to shadow every subsequent development in our growing relationship with humanity, an uncertainty that no amount of successful negotiation or growing trade partnership ever fully managed to dissolve. I overheard fragments of conversation during those 3 days that painted a picture far larger than anything happening at our own border checkpoint. Word had spread through assembly channels faster than any official communication could contain it, and other member species within the assembly's wide territory had begun quietly seeking information about what exactly had occurred. I learned, through a conversation between 2 visiting officials who did not realize how clearly their voices carried through the corridor outside the officers' mess, that at least 4 other species with long-standing grievances against assembly authority had already sent discreet inquiries toward known human territories, testing whether some new avenue for negotiation had suddenly opened where none had existed before. "They smell weakness," one of the officials muttered, though the other did not seem to share the same certainty in that assessment. "Or opportunity," the second replied. "There is a difference, though I admit I am not certain which one applies here." I thought about that exchange often over the following days, turning the distinction over in my mind during quiet moments between shifts. Weakness implied that something had been lost, some capability diminished or exposed as false. Opportunity implied something different entirely, the sudden appearance of a new player on a board that had remained largely unchanged for longer than any of us had been alive. I did not know which explanation frightened me more, though I suspected, as the days passed, that the truth might contain elements of both. Commander Draur called me into her private office on the second day, an occurrence rare enough that I felt a flicker of nervous uncertainty as I stepped through her door. She sat behind her desk studying a datapad, and she gestured for me to take the seat across from her without immediately looking up. "You spoke up during the initial encounter," she said finally, setting the pad aside and meeting my eyes directly. "Before the boarding pod launched, you expressed doubt about the wisdom of the operation." I felt a brief spike of anxiety, uncertain whether this conversation was heading toward commendation or reprimand, though her expression offered little clarity either way. "I did, ma'am," I admitted, though I could not have predicted what actually occurred. "No one could have," she said, a note of something almost like weariness entering her voice. "I have served this assembly for over 20 years, Officer Vesson. I have overseen dozens of enforcement operations, each one conducted with the same underlying assumption, that overwhelming demonstrated force resolves any dispute before it can properly begin. I have never once questioned that assumption until 3 days ago. I did not know how to respond to such an admission from someone of her rank, so I remained quiet, allowing her to continue if she chose to. "I want your honest assessment," she said. "Not the official report, not the version we will submit through proper channels. What did you actually see in that cargo hold?" I considered the question carefully before answering, wanting to give her something more useful than simply repeating what the sensors had already recorded. "I saw a species that does not respond to fear the way every other species we have encountered responds to it," I said finally. "Marsh showed no panic, no desperation, nothing that suggested the confrontation registered to him as genuinely threatening. I do not believe that was performance, ma'am. I believe it was simply how he experiences danger." Drower nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "That is my assessment as well," she said, "which raises an uncomfortable question. If an unarmed diplomat can withstand our most feared weapon without visible strain, what exactly does an armed and motivated member of his species look like? What does an entire fleet of them look like?" The question hung in the small office between us, and I felt the same cold unease I had experienced watching that blade fail to find its mark, spreading slowly through my chest all over again. "I do not know, ma'am," I admitted. "Neither do I," she said, "and I suspect that is precisely why Assembly Command has spent 3 days arranging this meeting rather than responding with further force. Nobody wants to discover the answer to that question through direct confrontation." The meeting itself, when it finally occurred, took place aboard a neutral Assembly diplomatic vessel that arrived at our position specifically for the occasion, its interior configured with the kind of formal ceremonial spaces reserved for only the most significant negotiations. I was not present within the meeting chamber itself, my rank falling far short of what such proceedings required, but I remained on monitoring duty aboard our own vessel, watching secondary feeds and status reports as the historic conversation unfolded somewhere beyond my direct observation. A junior aide who had served within the diplomatic vessel during the proceedings shared a few personal impressions with me weeks later over a quiet meal in the officers' mess, details that never made it into any official report I ever read. She described Marsh entering the meeting chamber without any of the ceremonial escort or display that senior assembly officials typically expected from visiting dignitaries, arriving instead with a single aide of his own and a small case containing nothing more dramatic than data records outlining proposed trade frameworks. He had greeted High Overseer Vole with what she described as genuine courtesy, expressing appreciation for the effort involved in arranging the meeting on such short notice, and had spent the opening portion of the discussion asking careful questions about assembly governance structures, rather than immediately presenting demands of his own. The aide told me that the turning point in the negotiations came roughly 2 hours into the discussion, when Overseer Vole had pressed Marsh directly about what would happen should the assembly refuse the terms he proposed. His answer, according to the aide, had been delivered without any change in his measured, unhurried tone. He had explained simply that humanity possessed no interest in conflict with the assembly, that their strong preference remained peaceful cooperation built on mutual respect, but that they would continue expanding their own diplomatic and trade relationships across the wider galaxy, regardless of whether the assembly chose to participate as a partner or simply observe from the outside. The choice, he had said, belonged entirely to the assembly, and humanity would respect whatever decision resulted, though he hoped, for the sake of both their peoples, that the assembly would choose partnership over the isolation that refusal would eventually produce. That answer, more than anything demonstrated in the cargo hold days earlier, seemed to have shifted the tenor of the entire negotiation. Overseer Vole had recognized, the aide suggested, that humanity was not attempting to displace assembly authority through direct confrontation, but was instead prepared to simply build an entirely parallel network of relationships across the galaxy, with or without assembly participation, a prospect that would isolate the assembly far more effectively than any single military threat ever could. The remaining hours of negotiation had proceeded, by the aide's account, with considerably more genuine cooperation than anyone had expected walking into that chamber. What I learned afterward, through official briefings distributed to the fleet in the following days, painted a picture that reshaped everything I had believed about the balance of power across known space. Ethan Marsh, it turned out, held a position within human diplomatic structures roughly equivalent to a senior envoy, though notably not their most senior rank, a detail that unsettled Assembly Command more than almost anything else revealed during that meeting. He had been selected for this specific first contact precisely because his species considered him expendable enough to risk in exactly the kind of confrontation that had occurred, while still carrying sufficient authority to negotiate meaningful terms once that initial test had concluded. The briefing described human history in broad strokes that I found difficult to fully absorb even after multiple readings. Their homeworld, it seemed, had produced a species shaped by an extraordinarily violent evolutionary history, countless generations spent surviving alongside predators and hazards that had selected relentlessly for physical resilience, rapid healing, and a psychological relationship with danger, unlike anything catalogued among any other species in the Assembly's extensive database. Where most species, including our own, had evolved fear responses designed to encourage retreat and avoidance, humans appeared to have developed something closer to calculated tolerance, a capacity to remain functional and clear-headed in circumstances that would overwhelm nearly any other mind in known space. More unsettling still was the section of the briefing describing human technological development. Their expansion beyond their home system had occurred with startling speed once it began, driven by an industrial capacity and cooperative organization that had allowed them to establish multiple colony worlds within a time frame that would have taken most assembly species several times as long to achieve. They had done this, notably, without any direct conflict with other assembly member species, expanding quietly along paths that had somehow avoided every contested territory and border dispute that defined so much of assembly history. I read that particular section several times, trying to understand what it implied. A species with humanity's apparent physical and psychological resilience, combined with rapid, efficient expansion and careful avoidance of unnecessary conflict, suggested something far more calculated than the simple aggressive dominance our doctrine had always assumed defined any truly dangerous new power. If anything, the pattern suggested patience, a willingness to grow strength quietly before ever needing to reveal it, and the demonstration in that cargo hold felt, in retrospect, less like an isolated event and more like the very first careful step of a much longer strategy. Word of the negotiations' broad terms filtered through the fleet gradually over the following weeks. Humanity had agreed to establish formal diplomatic relations with the Assembly, though notably on terms that granted them significant independence rather than the kind of subordinate integration the Assembly typically imposed on newly contacted species. There would be no tribute, no requirement to adopt Assembly governance structures, no obligation to submit to the kind of enforcement operations that had defined relationships with every other member species for generations. Assembly Command had, for what I understood to be the first time in living memory, negotiated as equals with a species they had originally intended to subdue through simple, overwhelming demonstration. I felt a complicated mixture of emotions as this understanding settled over me during those following weeks. Some part of me carried genuine relief that further conflict had been avoided, that whatever violence might have followed a different outcome in that cargo hold had been sidestepped through the strange, patient calm of a single envoy. But beneath that relief sat something harder to name, a quiet unease that refused to fully dissolve no matter how many official briefings I read insisting the situation had resolved favorably for all involved. A detailed report crossed my desk during the second week following the negotiations, describing a border dispute that had flared along a distant assembly frontier shared with a species called the Orinth, longtime members of the assembly who had quietly resented certain trade restrictions imposed on their territory for well over a generation. In previous years, such disputes had always followed a familiar and predictable pattern, a show of assembly force sufficient to remind the Orinth of their place within the larger structure, followed by a period of resentful compliance that lasted until the next flare of tension years later. This time, according to the report, Orinth negotiators had approached the dispute with an unfamiliar confidence, referencing openly, in formal diplomatic correspondence, the recent events at our border checkpoint as evidence that assembly enforcement no longer carried the same absolute weight it once had. They had not directly threatened to seek human support, understanding perhaps that such an alliance remained far from guaranteed, but the mere suggestion that alternatives now existed beyond simple assembly compliance had shifted the entire tone of the negotiation. Assembly Command, according to the report, had ultimately conceded several of the trade restrictions the Orinth had spent years unsuccessfully contesting, a resolution that would have seemed almost unthinkable only months earlier. I read similar accounts over the following weeks from other sectors scattered across assembly territory, each one describing some variation of the same underlying shift, smaller species finding new leverage in old disputes, established member worlds questioning arrangements they had accepted without complaint for generations. Even among species who had never expressed any particular resentment toward assembly governance, I noticed a subtle but unmistakable change in the tone of official communications, a new willingness to ask pointed questions rather than simply accept whatever terms assembly representatives proposed. I found myself thinking often about Corveth during those weeks, wondering how he had processed an outcome that stood so completely outside everything his training had ever prepared him to expect. I heard, through quiet channels that I could not fully verify, that he had requested reassignment away from active enforcement duty following the incident, a request that Assembly Command had apparently granted without argument. I never learned where he was sent, or what became of him afterward, though I found myself hoping, in whatever quiet way I allowed myself such hopes, that he had found something resembling peace in whatever came next. Other assembly officers I spoke with during that period carried a similar unresolved tension beneath their outward composure, a recognition that something fundamental had shifted in our understanding of our place among the stars. We had built our entire relationship with the wider galaxy around the certainty that our capacity for overwhelming force made us the most dangerous power any newly encountered species needed to fear. That certainty had shattered in the space of a single confrontation, replaced by an unfamiliar awareness that somewhere beyond our carefully mapped borders existed a species whose true capabilities we had only just begun to glimpse, and whose patience suggested they were in no hurry at all to reveal the rest. 6 months passed before I received the transfer orders that would change the course of my entire career, though at the time I understood almost nothing about what they would actually require of me. Assembly Command had established a new division shortly after the negotiations concluded, a small and carefully selected group tasked with managing all matters related to human relations, and my name appeared, unexpectedly, among the officers selected for reassignment. I learned later, through a conversation with Commander Dryor before I departed the Ashvan Vigil for the final time, that my selection had come directly from her recommendation. She told me, in the quiet privacy of her office, that my willingness to voice doubt before the original confrontation had marked me as someone capable of thinking beyond the rigid assumptions that had shaped so much of assembly doctrine for generations. I did not know whether to feel honored or unsettled by that assessment, though I suspected, in the months that followed, that both reactions were entirely appropriate. The Human Affairs Division operated from a modest station situated in neutral space between assembly territory and the outer boundary of what our maps now labeled, with careful new precision, as human-controlled systems. I arrived to find a staff far smaller than I expected for a division tasked with something as significant as managing relations with an entirely new galactic power, though I came to understand quickly that this modest size reflected something important about how Assembly Command had chosen to approach the situation. Nobody wanted to draw excessive attention to how seriously we were now treating a species we had originally dismissed as a footnote in our database. My first assignment within the division involved reviewing incoming diplomatic communications from other Assembly member species, and it was through this work that I began to understand the true scope of what had shifted across known space since that single confrontation months earlier. The two officials I had overheard speaking in the corridor outside the mess hall had been entirely correct in their assessment, though I now understood their conversation had barely scratched the surface of what was actually occurring. Species after species, some long-time loyal members of the Assembly and others who had chafed under its authority for generations without ever finding the leverage to resist, had begun quietly establishing their own independent contact with human representatives. I read reports describing formal trade delegations sent from 3 different Outer Rim territories, each one seeking to establish relationships that existed entirely outside Assembly oversight. I read accounts of smaller, less powerful species who had spent decades paying tribute to more dominant Assembly members, suddenly finding new confidence in negotiations, citing, sometimes directly and sometimes through careful implication, the existence of this new power that had proven capable of standing entirely unmoved before Assembly enforcement. The word spreading through these channels carried a phrase that I encountered so often during those early weeks that it began to feel less like description and more like something approaching legend. They called humanity the species that could not be frightened, and though I understood the phrase simplified something far more complicated than simple fearlessness, I also understood why it had taken hold so quickly across a galaxy that had spent generations organizing itself entirely around the currency of fear. I met my first human colleague during my 3rd week within the division, a logistics coordinator named Claire Bennett, who had been assigned to our station as part of the ongoing diplomatic exchange established during the initial negotiations. I approached that first meeting with considerable apprehension, my mind still carrying vivid memories of that cargo hold footage, despite the months that had passed since I first witnessed it. What I found instead surprised me in ways I had not anticipated. Bennett greeted me with warmth that felt entirely genuine, asking thoughtful questions about my own species and our history, with a curiosity that carried no trace of the calculated patience I had observed in Marsh's recorded transmissions. She laughed easily during our conversations, expressed frustration over minor logistical complications in ways that felt entirely ordinary, and generally behaved like any competent professional navigating an unfamiliar workplace far from home. I found myself, during those early weeks working alongside her, gradually revising the picture I had built of humanity based entirely on a single extraordinary encounter. Bennett was not Marsh. She did not carry the same unshakable calm in the face of danger, admitting freely during one conversation that she found space travel through unfamiliar territory genuinely nerve-wracking, despite years of experience doing exactly that. She startled at unexpected loud noises the same way I did. She expressed worry about her family back on her homeworld with an openness that reminded me, uncomfortably, of my own concerns for people I had left behind when I accepted this reassignment. "Not everyone is like him," she told me one afternoon, when I finally worked up the nerve to ask her directly about the footage that had circulated so widely through Assembly channels. We were reviewing supply manifests together in the small shared office we had come to occupy, and she set her datapad aside when I asked the question, giving me her full attention. "Ethan gets selected for exactly this kind of work because he genuinely does not process danger the way most people do. It is not common among us, even if your Assembly's records probably suggest otherwise by now." "Then why send him?" I asked. "If he does not represent your species accurately, why use him to establish that first impression?" Bennett considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Because first impressions matter more than accuracy. In situations like that," she said finally, "your Assembly built its relationship with every other species around fear. We needed you to understand, clearly and immediately, That fear was not going to work as a foundation for how you dealt with us. Using someone like Ethan made that point faster and more clearly than months of careful diplomatic conversation ever could have. I turned that answer over in my mind for a long time afterward, understanding gradually that the entire encounter, painful and unsettling as it had felt from within the confrontation itself, had been a deliberate and carefully calculated choice rather than an accident of circumstance. Humanity had understood, perhaps better than we understood ourselves, exactly what kind of demonstration would be required to shift our fundamental approach to dealing with them, and they had executed that demonstration with a precision that left almost nothing to chance. I recall one particular report crossing my desk during that period, which stayed with me longer than most, describing a small trading outpost near the edge of assembly territory where a minor dispute had broken out between local officials and a group of human merchants operating under an early exploratory trade license. The dispute itself was unremarkable, a disagreement over docking fees that had escalated further than it should have due to simple miscommunication between officials unfamiliar with each other's customs. What struck me about the report was not the dispute, but its resolution. Rather than involving any show of force from either side, the human merchant delegation had requested a joint review panel, insisting on a process that gave equal weight to assembly regulations and human trade custom alike, and had waited, with what the report described as remarkable patience, through nearly 2 full weeks of careful administrative review before a fair resolution was finally reached. No threats were exchanged, no demonstrations of capability were offered or requested. The entire matter concluded through nothing more dramatic than persistent, calm insistence on a fair process, and I found myself struck by how thoroughly that pattern matched everything I had come to understand about Marsh himself, a preference for patient process over dramatic confrontation whenever patient process remained genuinely available. I raised this observation during a briefing several weeks later, addressing a room of senior assembly diplomats who had gathered to discuss ongoing developments across the wider galaxy. My assessment, delivered with more confidence than I had expected to feel given my relatively junior standing among those present, suggested that we needed to fundamentally reconsider our approach, not just to humanity specifically, but to the entire framework of fear-based dominance that had defined assembly expansion for generations. The reaction in that room varied considerably, some officials nodding thoughtfully at my analysis, while others regarded me with the kind of skeptical patience reserved for junior officers who had perhaps grown overly attached to a single dramatic incident. I understood their skepticism, even as I remained convinced of my own assessment. Generations of doctrine did not unravel easily, even in the face of evidence as striking as what had occurred in that cargo hold. But the evidence continued accumulating regardless of institutional resistance. Reports arrived over the following months, describing similar patterns of quiet confidence spreading among species that had never previously questioned assembly authority. Border disputes that would once have been resolved through simple demonstration of force instead stretched into prolonged negotiations, as member species increasingly understood that the old certainties no longer applied with the same absolute weight they once carried. I watched from my modest position within the Human Affairs Division as the entire architecture of galactic power slowly began reorganizing itself around a new and uncomfortable truth that nobody had asked for and few genuinely welcomed. I traveled, during my second year with the division, to a small diplomatic outpost situated near the edge of officially recognized human territory, tasked with observing ongoing trade discussions between assembly representatives and a rotating group of human officials. It was there that I finally encountered Ethan Marsh again, in person rather than through recorded footage, standing among a delegation reviewing proposed shipping routes with the same quiet, unhurried attention I remembered from that first transmission so many months earlier. He recognized me, somehow, though we had never formally met beyond that brief and devastating encounter recorded through Corvette's helmet feed. He approached me during a break in the proceedings, offering a handshake that felt entirely ordinary, despite everything I knew about the strength contained within his grip. "Officer Vassin," he said, and I felt a small jolt of surprise that he remembered my name at all. I understand you have been instrumental in helping your assembly reconsider certain long-standing assumptions. I have tried, I said carefully, uncertain how much honesty this conversation could safely accommodate. It has not always been easy work. It rarely is, he agreed, his expression carrying something that looked almost like genuine sympathy. Changing an entire civilization's understanding of itself takes considerably longer than a single demonstration, however dramatic that demonstration might have been. I am sorry it required what it required. I have thought about that day more than you might expect. I studied his face carefully, searching for any trace of the calculated coldness I might have expected from someone who had orchestrated such a precisely deliberate act of intimidation. I found instead something that looked genuinely like regret, softened by the same patient calm that had defined every previous encounter I witnessed him navigate. Was there truly no other way? I asked, the question escaping before I had fully decided whether I wanted to voice it. Marsh considered the question with the same unhurried seriousness he seemed to bring to everything. Perhaps, he said finally. I have wondered the same thing myself, more than once, but I believe, even now, that a longer path built on words alone would have cost more lives in the long run than the single difficult afternoon we spent establishing a clearer understanding between our peoples. Your assembly has built peace, of a kind, across 1,000 worlds through fear. We simply needed you to understand that fear could no longer be the foundation of how you dealt with us, before that misunderstanding led somewhere far more costly than a single test in an empty cargo hold. I did not have a ready response to that reasoning, and Marsh did not seem to expect one. He offered a small, respectful nod before returning to his delegation, leaving me standing there with thoughts I would spend considerably longer than that single afternoon working through in the months and years that followed. I returned to my quarters that evening and found myself unable to sleep, my mind turning over the conversation again and again, searching for some settled place to rest my thoughts. I had spent nearly 2 years now studying humanity from every angle available to me, reading their history, speaking with their diplomats, watching the slow and careful way their influence continued spreading across the galaxy, without ever resorting to the kind of aggressive expansion our own doctrine had always assumed any truly dangerous power would eventually pursue. What troubled me most, lying awake in that small station quarters so far from the world where I had been born, was not the strength humanity had demonstrated in that single dramatic confrontation. Strength alone, however impressive, could be measured and planned around, incorporated into new strategies the way every other variable in assembly calculations eventually found its place. What troubled me instead was the patience, the deliberate and unhurried way humanity approached every interaction I had witnessed since that first encounter, as though they were playing a game measured across generations rather than the shorter spans of ambition and consequence that had always shaped assembly thinking. I thought about the industrial capacity noted so briefly in that first intelligence briefing, the multiple colony worlds established within a time frame that should have taken far longer by every metric we understood. I thought about the careful avoidance of conflict during that same period of rapid expansion, a restraint that felt, the longer I considered it, less like caution and more like deliberate strategy, a species building its foundation quietly before ever needing to reveal the true scope of what it had built. I began keeping a private journal during that period, a habit I had never previously maintained, filling its pages with observations that felt too speculative or too personal to include in any official report. I wrote about small moments that struck me as significant in ways I could not always fully articulate. A human trade representative who insisted on learning basic greetings in 3 different assembly languages before a routine meeting. A human engineer who spent an entire afternoon patiently explaining their propulsion technology to a group of curious assembly technicians without ever once treating the exchange as an opportunity to demonstrate superiority. Those small moments accumulated into something larger the longer I paid attention to them, a pattern of genuine curiosity and willingness to engage that sat uneasily alongside the calculated patience I had witnessed in that first confrontation. I began to understand, gradually, that humanity was not a single uniform thing any more than the many species within our own assembly formed a single uniform thing. There were those among them, like Bennett, who approached every interaction with open warmth and genuine friendliness. There were others, like Marsh, whose calm carried a colder, more deliberate calculation beneath its surface. Both existed simultaneously within the same broader civilization, and I suspected that understanding this complexity mattered more than any single simplified narrative, whether that narrative painted humanity as an unstoppable threat or as an entirely benevolent new partner. I shared some of these observations during informal conversations with other officers within the division, finding that most of my colleagues had reached similar conclusions through their own independent experiences. We began, gradually, to develop a more nuanced institutional understanding of humanity than the single dramatic incident that had originally brought us together, though I noticed that this nuanced understanding rarely made its way fully into the official reports Assembly Command received, which continued, even years later, to reference that first confrontation as the primary lens through which broader policy decisions were made. I raised these concerns during a private conversation with the director of our small division, a senior official named Paris Vantel, who had overseen human affairs since its earliest formation. She listened to my assessment with the careful attention she brought to every conversation, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before responding. "You are not the first to voice that concern," she told me. "Several analysts within Assembly Command have raised similar observations." The honest answer, Officer Vesson, is that we do not yet know what humanity ultimately intends, whether their patience reflects careful long-term strategy or simply a cultural preference for measured, deliberate growth. We have very little precedent for a species that behaves the way they behave, and precedent has always been the foundation of how Assembly Command makes its decisions. "What do we do in the absence of precedent?" I asked. Vantel considered the question seriously before answering. "We watch," she said finally. "We build genuine relationships where we can, the way you have with your colleague Bennett. We remain honest about what we do not understand, rather than pretending old certainties still apply simply because admitting otherwise feels uncomfortable. And we prepare ourselves, as best we are able, for the possibility that the balance of power across this galaxy has shifted in ways we will spend decades still coming to fully understand." I carried that conversation with me through the remainder of my assignment within the division, returning to it often during quiet moments when the accumulated weight of everything I had witnessed threatened to feel like more than I could reasonably process. There was no simple resolution to the questions humanity's arrival had raised, no tidy conclusion that restored the comfortable certainties I had carried through my earlier years of service. There was only the ongoing work of understanding, conversation by conversation, report by report, a species that had arrived quietly and left an entire galaxy reconsidering everything it believed about strength and fear and the true foundations of lasting peace. 3 years after that first encounter aboard the HFY Vigil, I received orders that brought me back, unexpectedly, to precisely the same border checkpoint where this entire story had begun. Assembly Command had requested my presence for a routine review of the sector, part of an ongoing effort to assess how relations with human territory had evolved since those early, uncertain months following the initial contact. I did not expect the assignment to carry any particular emotional weight, yet I felt something tighten in my chest the moment our shuttle approached the familiar coordinates, memory rising unbidden as the checkpoint came back into view. The sector looked different now, busier in ways that reflected the genuine trade relationship that had developed between our peoples over the intervening years. Cargo vessels moved steadily along established routes, carrying goods between assembly territory and human-controlled systems with the kind of routine efficiency that would have seemed impossible to imagine during those first tense hours when a single unarmed ship had appeared without warning at this very boundary. I watched the traffic pass across our sensor display and felt a complicated mixture of relief and lingering unease, the same combination of feelings that had accompanied nearly every reflection on this subject over the past 3 years. I met with the current commander of the checkpoint station, a young officer named Ivan Cassel, who had not served here during the original incident, but had clearly studied its details extensively as part of her preparation for the posting. She walked me through recent developments with obvious pride, describing the smooth trade agreements now governing this section of border space, the regular diplomatic exchanges that had become routine rather than remarkable, the general sense of stability that had settled over a relationship that once seemed poised to unravel into something far more dangerous. "It is easy to forget how tense things were at the beginning," she said, as we reviewed traffic reports together in her small operations office. "Reading about it in training modules feels very different from what you must have experienced firsthand." I considered how to answer her honestly, wanting to convey something true about that period, without diminishing the genuine progress that had occurred since. "The tension has not disappeared," I told her finally. "It has simply changed shape. We understand each other better now, which has made cooperation possible in ways that seemed unlikely 3 years ago. But understanding is not the same as certainty, and I do not think either side has fully settled into complete trust of the other. Not yet." Cassel nodded thoughtfully, and I could see her turning the distinction over in her mind, weighing it against everything she had learned through official channels before arriving at this posting. I appreciated her willingness to actually consider the point, rather than simply accepting the comfortable version of events that so often circulated through official assembly narratives. I spent several days at the checkpoint completing my review, and during that time, I received word that a human diplomatic vessel would be passing through the sector, part of a routine exchange mission, traveling toward a newly established trade outpost further along the border. I found myself watching for its arrival with an attention that surprised me, some part of my mind still carrying the echo of that first tense encounter even after everything that had changed in the years since. The vessel that eventually appeared on our sensors looked nothing like the small, unremarkable ship that had first crossed this boundary 3 years earlier. This one carried visible markings identifying it clearly as a diplomatic transport, its approach smooth and entirely expected, accompanied by proper advance notice and full compliance with every established protocol now governing such crossings. I watched it move through the checkpoint with an ease that felt, in its own quiet way, like a genuine measure of how far our two peoples had traveled since that first uncertain contact. I did not expect to encounter anyone I recognized aboard that particular vessel, and I was surprised, during the brief diplomatic exchange that accompanied its passage through the checkpoint, to find Claire Bennett among the small delegation that disembarked for a short courtesy meeting with station officials. She recognized me immediately, her expression brightening with genuine warmth as she crossed the room to greet me properly. "I did not expect to find you here," she said, and I found myself smiling at the easy familiarity in her voice, a stark contrast to the careful formality that had characterized so many of our earlier interactions within the Human Affairs Division. "How long has it been?" "Nearly a year since I last saw you," I said, "longer since we last worked together directly." We spoke for a while about the developments within her own career, about mutual colleagues from our shared time within the division, about the general trajectory of the relationship between our peoples that had continued evolving steadily since those early uncertain months. It was, in many ways, an entirely ordinary conversation between two colleagues who had built genuine mutual respect across years of working alongside each other, and I found real comfort in that ordinariness after everything else this particular sector of space had come to represent in my memory. Before her delegation departed, I asked her a question that had lingered in my mind for years, without ever finding a suitable moment for asking. "Do you know what became of Ethan Marsh?" I said. "I met him once, briefly, at that outpost near your border territory. I have often wondered where his work has taken him since." Bennett's expression shifted slightly, something thoughtful entering her eyes. "He continues doing similar work," she said. "Establishing initial contact with other species our exploration teams encounter as we continue expanding our diplomatic reach. I understand there have been several more encounters recently, in regions considerably further from both our territories than anything either of us has previously dealt with directly." "More encounters," I repeated, feeling a familiar unease stir somewhere beneath my ribs. "Similar to what happened here?" Bennett considered her answer carefully before speaking, and I could see her weighing how much she felt comfortable sharing even with someone she considered a genuine friend after these years of working together. Not identical, she said finally. Each situation requires its own approach, depending on the particular circumstances and history of whatever species we encounter. But the underlying principle remains consistent. We prefer to establish clarity early, even when that clarity requires an uncomfortable demonstration, rather than allow misunderstanding to fester into something far more costly down the line. I thought about that answer for a long time after her delegation departed, watching their vessel move away from the checkpoint and continue onward toward whatever destination awaited them further along the border. Somewhere out among the vast unmapped reaches of the galaxy, other species were likely, even now, encountering their own version of that small gray ship arriving without warning, their own version of a calm, patient envoy waiting to see what kind of response their presence would provoke. I returned to my quarters that final evening at the checkpoint and composed a brief personal report, separate from the official assessment I would submit to Assembly Command, recording my own reflections on everything I had witnessed and learned across these past 3 years. I wrote about the genuine progress achieved through patient diplomacy, about the friendships that had formed across what once seemed like an impossible divide between our peoples, about the careful, ongoing work of building trust between civilizations that had begun their relationship through such an unsettling confrontation. But I also wrote, with the same honesty I had offered Officer Cassell during our earlier conversation, about the unresolved unease that continued lingering beneath all of that genuine progress. Humanity had arrived at our border 3 years earlier and demonstrated, through a single unarmed envoy, a capacity for calm endurance that shattered every assumption our assembly had built its authority upon. They had done so deliberately, with careful calculation, understanding precisely what kind of demonstration would be required to establish the terms of a relationship on their own preferred foundation rather than ours. That same deliberate, patient calculation was continuing now, Bennett's words suggested, extending outward toward other species across the galaxy who had not yet encountered anything like what our assembly experienced at this very checkpoint, did not know how many other civilizations were even now discovering, for the first time, exactly what it meant to face a species that simply did not respond to fear the way every other power among the stars had always assumed intelligent life must respond to it. I closed my report with a single observation that I had carried since that very first day, watching a small gray ship hang motionless in the dark, while an entire bridge crew held its breath, uncertain what kind of nightmare had just arrived at the edge of everything we understood. The assembly had spent generations building its authority around the certainty that fear was the only language every species in the galaxy would eventually learn to speak. We had just discovered, through a single quiet and unhurried confrontation, that somewhere among the stars existed a species that had simply never needed to learn that language at all, and now, patiently, deliberately, one careful encounter at a time, they were teaching the rest of the galaxy an entirely different lesson instead. I set the report aside and looked out through the small viewport of my quarters, watching the distant lights of passing vessels move steadily along routes that had not existed only 3 years earlier, routes built from the strange and uncertain foundation laid down in that single unforgettable confrontation. Whatever the galaxy was becoming, shaped now by the quiet, patient presence of a species that refused to be frightened, I understood that I was watching only the very beginning of a story that would continue unfolding for generations, carried forward by envoys and diplomats and ordinary officers like myself, each of us slowly learning to navigate a universe that had grown larger and stranger and considerably less certain than any of us had ever believed it could be. My assignment at the checkpoint concluded a week later, and before departing for my return journey, I requested a final walk through the lower observation deck of the station, the same kind of space where I had once overheard nervous crew members whispering about boarding pods and silent operatives so many years earlier. The deck had changed considerably since those tense early days, now lined with informational displays describing the trade partnerships that had grown steadily across this sector, small exhibits celebrating cultural exchange programs between assembly worlds and various human colonies that had become almost commonplace parts of daily operations here. I paused before one particular display, describing the history of the checkpoint itself, and found, Tucked within a broader timeline of the sector's development, a brief and carefully worded summary of the original encounter that had started everything. The display described it simply as the first contact incident, offering no further detail beyond acknowledging that a demonstration of mutual capability had occurred before formal negotiations began. I stood there for a long while, reading those few sparse sentences, understanding that most who passed this display in the years ahead would never grasp the full weight of what those careful words represented, the fear and confusion and slowly dawning understanding that had filled this exact station on that single unforgettable day. A young assembly cadet paused beside me while I stood there, glancing at the same display with the casual curiosity of someone encountering old history rather than living memory. She looked at me, perhaps noticing something in my expression that marked me as someone with a more personal connection to the events described, and asked, with the straightforward honesty that seemed common among cadets not yet worn down by years of careful diplomatic caution, whether the stories she had heard about that first encounter were actually true. I considered how to answer her, weighing the simplified versions that had circulated through popular retellings against the far more complicated truth I had personally witnessed. Some of it, I told her finally, the essential facts are accurate. An operative was sent to deal with a single unarmed envoy, and the envoy proved considerably more capable than anyone expected. But the stories tend to focus only on that single dramatic moment, when the truth is that the moment itself was only the very beginning of something far larger and more complicated than any single confrontation could ever fully capture. She seemed to consider that answer seriously, nodding slowly before asking a follow-up question that caught me slightly off guard. "Do you think it was the right choice," she asked, "sending the operative in the first place, or negotiating with them afterward instead of trying to prove ourselves in some other way?" I thought about that question for a long moment before answering, drawing on everything I had learned across the years since that first confrontation. "I think we made the only choices available to us at the time, given what we understood and did not understand about the situation we faced," I said. "Whether they were the right choices, I am honestly not certain even now. What I do believe is that the outcome, however uncomfortable it was to arrive at, has produced something more valuable than the outcome we originally intended to enforce. We have a genuine relationship now, built on mutual respect rather than simple fear, and I do not believe we would have found our way to that relationship through the path we originally planned to take." The cadet thanked me for the perspective and continued on her way, leaving me alone once more with that small, understated display, describing an event that had reshaped the entire trajectory of assembly history. I remained there a while longer, watching the steady flow of traffic passing through the checkpoint beyond the observation windows, cargo vessels, and diplomatic transports moving along routes that connected two civilizations who had begun their relationship through an encounter neither side had fully understood at the time. I thought, standing there, about every officer who had served alongside me during those original tense hours, about Commander Dreor, who I had learned, through occasional updates passed along official channels, had gone on to oversee several subsequent negotiations with growing skill and confidence. Her early uncertainty about that first confrontation gradually transformed into genuine expertise in navigating this new and unfamiliar relationship between our peoples. I thought about Ren Kala, still serving aboard the Ashvan Vigil, according to the most recent reports I had seen, and about Talis Doreen, who had transferred to a research division, studying human technology and culture, with what I understood to be considerable enthusiasm for her new work. And I thought, as I so often did during quiet moments like this one, about Corveth, wherever he had ended up after requesting reassignment away from active enforcement duty. I hoped, in whatever way such hopes were reasonable to hold for someone I had only ever observed through a helmet-mounted camera feed, that he had found some measure of peace in whatever new purpose Assembly Command had eventually found for him. I hoped that the training that had shaped him so completely into an instrument of absolute, merciless efficiency had not left him entirely without the capacity to build something gentler in the years that remained ahead of him. My shuttle departed the checkpoint later that same day, carrying me back toward my ongoing assignment within the Human Affairs Division, back toward the steady, patient work of building understanding between two civilizations who had begun their relationship through fear and confusion, but who had, gradually, carefully, found their way toward something considerably more valuable in the years since. I watched the checkpoint grow smaller through the shuttle's rear viewport, the same boundary line where a small gray ship had once appeared without warning and changed the course of everything I understood about power and fear and the true foundations of lasting peace between civilizations who had never expected to need each other at all. The galaxy continued expanding outward in every direction, filled with countless other species who had not yet encountered humanity, who did not yet know what awaited them somewhere along their own eventual first contact with a species that simply refused to be frightened. I did not know what those future encounters would bring, whether they would follow the same uncomfortable but ultimately productive path our own encounter had taken, or whether some other outcome entirely awaited species whose circumstances differed enough from our own to change the calculation in ways I could not predict from where I sat. What I knew, with a certainty built from years of careful observation and hard-won understanding, was that the galaxy I had grown up believing in, one where assembly strength represented the final and absolute word on every matter of consequence, no longer existed in the way it once had. Something new had arrived among the stars, patient and calm and utterly unwilling to be intimidated by anything the rest of us had ever considered a credible threat, and the slow, careful work of learning to share this vast and complicated galaxy with such a species would continue, I understood, for generations far beyond my own modest contribution to its beginning. Somewhere behind me, growing smaller with every passing moment, the checkpoint continued its steady work of connecting two civilizations that had once stood ready to misunderstand each other completely, its traffic lanes filled now with vessels carrying goods and passengers and ideas between worlds that had spent generations existing in complete ignorance of one another's existence. I thought about the countless small interactions that made up that traffic, the trade negotiations and cultural exchanges, and quiet friendships forming one conversation at a time, each one a small thread woven into something far larger than any single encounter could represent on its own. I thought, too, about the cadet I had spoken with earlier that day, and about the countless others like her who would grow up within this reshaped galaxy without ever carrying the particular weight of memory that I still carried from those original uncertain hours. For her, and for those who came after her, humanity's arrival would simply be history, a chapter in a longer story, rather than a lived and breathing uncertainty that had once kept an entire bridge crew frozen in stunned silence. I found something quietly comforting in that thought, the understanding that even the most unsettling beginnings eventually settled into something steadier, something that future generations could build upon without carrying the same raw uncertainty that had defined it for those of us who lived through its earliest days. The shuttle carried me onward through the dark, and I allowed my thoughts to drift finally toward simpler things, toward the modest quarters waiting for me back at the Human Affairs Station, toward the ongoing work that still awaited my attention there, and toward the strange, unexpected privilege of having witnessed, firsthand, the very beginning of a relationship that would continue shaping the galaxy for generations far beyond anything I would ever personally see unfold. Whatever uncertainty still lingered about where that relationship would ultimately lead, I understood, in that quiet moment aboard a shuttle carrying me steadily onward through the stars, that I had at least played some small part in helping it begin on a foundation sturdier than fear alone, and for now, that understanding felt like enough. I settled back into my seat as the shuttle carried me onward, watching the stars stretch out ahead through the forward viewport, and allowed myself, finally, after so many years of careful uncertainty, to feel something that resembled genuine hope rather than simple unease about whatever still lay ahead in this newly reshaped and uncertain galaxy we all now shared together.